And good morning. It's time for the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by Renegade River in Spring Lake. And here is your host, Mike Hewitt.
Hey, good morning. Brian, I think you've been practicing that.
Oh, you think so?
Oh, yeah. Oh, you got that entrance down to a science now.
Well, thanks for noticing.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks, it was a slippery drive in this morning. But before I get into the show, let me make a real brief, like a public service announcement, if I might. There's a collection happening across the state of Michigan for non-perishable foods, canned goods, that are being collected up and are inevitably heading to homeless shelters that specifically work with vets. And so the collection point in our area is at Renegade River, which is 106 West Savage in downtown Spring Lake next to the police department. We're trying to collect up as much as we can between now and the morning of February 20th. So if you could stop by and deliver some non-perishables, I'm sure there's some folks that would appreciate it. And it doesn't necessarily matter what your opinion is of war and the U.S. Armed Services and all of that. I'm not trying to make this a political thing, but those folks that get sent off to battle don't necessarily come back the way they left, and some of them need some help. So with that, let me dive into the show. We've got on the line with us today, our guest is Carla Gurick. Carla, am I saying your name correctly?
Oh, that's close enough. Garrick, yes.
Garrick, okay, I was making a pretty good stab at it.
Yeah.
Listen, you are the president of Free State Project, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And folks can find Free State Project at freestateproject.org. One of the things I found fascinating, Carla, is in the exchange of emails that I had with one of the folks that help you, and maybe it was you, I saw in the subject line it said capitalism, libertarianism, cold weather, and freedom. So with that as the lead-in, tell us a little bit about your organization, if you would.
Sure. So the Free State Project has been around for more than a decade, and basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to concentrate liberty activists in the state of New Hampshire, and that's kind of where the cold part comes in.
Right.
Of course, we have our winters here, although you guys are pretty cold over there as well. And so we have about 16,500 people who've signed up. The way the project works is once we hit 20,000, people have 5 years after that 20,000 number to move to New Hampshire. In typical sort of, don't give me orders fashion, a bunch of us decided that we weren't going to wait till we hit that 20,000 number. We're going to start moving because we think it's a great strategy, and I've been in New Hampshire now for almost 8 years, and it turns out it has been a great strategy. Concentrating people who are really passionate about liberty together means that, we can actually start to affect change and move things in a pro-liberty direction, or at least, cling to those last rights we have.
Tell me a little bit. I guess I want to get my head around the concept. And so when you folks, when your office reached out to me, I don't consider myself a libertarian, by the way, but I do call myself often a classical liberal, and I do separate the two. But that issue aside, I find I'm trying to get my head around it. Is the idea to move these 20,000 people to a new community, or just spread out across New Hampshire? Or the very first thought that came to mind was shades of yesteryear, and I was thinking about a commune. But tell me how it works.
So it's not a commune. People come and they do live all over the state. We have big concentrations in the biggest city in the state, which is Manchester, which has a population of about 120,000. There's a concentration in Keene, which is sort of a bucolic college town. And then really people just live all over. The reason New Hampshire was selected, and that was actually done by vote in 2003, and we were looking at some other states, Wyoming, Alaska, the Dakotas. What all of these places, of course, have in common, other than the cold, I guess status like warm weather, but is that, they're fairly low population, they're low tax as compared to other parts of the country. And so the idea was, in a state like New Hampshire that has a population of about 1.2 million, it doesn't have to be that we're all concentrated concentrated physically together in some kind of commune. It's that people come. We see a lot of young movers, typically people who just graduated college, who are getting married. They kind of come, they rent a place for a while, then they get their dog, they get their truck, they get married, their wives get pregnant, and then they buy their house, and that sort of seems to be a process. But we also, of course, get people, from all walks of life. Surprisingly, also retirees decide to come here, So a lot of times people sort of tend to move when they have that change of life experience. We also have a large veteran community of people, once they get back. Sometimes I think people get a little disillusioned and are seeking answers, and the Free State Project really provides that answer. One of the things that's also fascinating about New Hampshire is it actually has the third largest legislature in the English-speaking world. So our state house here has 400 reps. So each rep represents about 3,000, 3,200 people, which means you actually know your rep. You see them at the grocery store, you see her at the library, and I think that makes a difference as well in the sense that most of us are really quite passionate about localism or keeping, our politics on a local level where it's more controllable as opposed to, sort of the behemoths we have now out in Washington.
Your state legislature, on that, before we move on, is that a part-time legislature?
It is. They are currently in session, so I've been going up to the State House from time to time. They only earn $100 a year, and their only perk is they don't have to pay the tolls, and they get some parking close to the State House. And so I think that is also, a great plus. It's not, people aren't in it, obviously, for the money, so it tends to attract fairly,
regular people
who care about things.
Sure,
Yeah.
regular people. Tell me now, and I'm just for listeners and for my benefit, I want to. Michigan is one of 4 states that have a full-time legislature, and so periodically, like every 2 years, there's a new push politically in Michigan to try to return Michigan back to a part-time legislature. And of course, the debate just ended, and it'll start again next year. And I'll always be a part of it because I absolutely am. You couldn't get any more opposed to a full-time legislature than I am. That issue aside, there was a lot of talk along the path about having Michigan be I can't remember the word for it, and I'm drawing a blank. I almost say unicorn, but that's not it. But where you just have one chamber, you don't have a Senate and a House of Representatives. But in New Hampshire, do you have both chambers, Senate and House of Representatives?
We do. The Senate is fairly small. It's 24 senators, and it's interesting. In some ways, I feel like it would be better if it was, one chamber, just because, but I guess the thinking is, we've got the checks and balances. The House comes up with something. The Senate, is supposed to balance that. But certainly in some cases, it just seems like it's, not the most efficient way to get things done.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I think it's designed not to be efficient. And by the way, and by the way, I support that.
Yes.
But the reason that I do is that, the idea was to avoid a democracy. We didn't want mob rule. And the way to avoid that, one of the many mechanisms to avoid that, is to cause legislation to slowly move forward and not be a knee-jerk reaction to some individual circumstance, which so often populist politics demands of our various state and federal legislatures. And that, to me, that's very unfortunate because it's supposed to move slow on purpose. So whenever I hear people rail against gridlock, I'm thinking, the founders wouldn't like that conversation because they set up a system that they wanted gridlock from.
Yes, I fully agree with that. The less they do, the better for us.
Yeah, that's talking about Obama for a moment with all of his vacations, and some of the folks that are on my side of the aisle will be snarky about the idea. He's on vacation again. He's golfing again. I'm thinking, great. That means Liberty and Treasury can take a break from running so hard. So that's kind of how I see that. I'm a little bit perplexed still about why New Hampshire was chosen, and maybe this is a maybe I've got an inaccurate perception, so you can maybe set me straight a little bit. But frankly, whenever I think of the New England states or the East Coast in general, in fact, I often refer to it as the Lost Coast, because I see it at least as being very uber left wing. And I know that New Hampshire has got some libertarian policies, but I also know that they voted the lion's share twice in a row for Premier Obama. So I'm thinking, how did that happen that a group of libertarians chose New Hampshire?
Well, I think there was, there are compelling reasons. Of course, New Hampshire is sort of still this last little bastion on the East Coast as compared to the states around it. There's good gun laws. We have, the low taxes, as I mentioned. It's an appealing place. I think at the time when they took the vote, the then Governor Benson actually was very keen on the idea. So he probably did some, sort of subtle lobbying. The vote wasn't taken by all the participants. I actually joined up the year after the vote was taken. So it's not an issue. It was a small group of people who voted. I think they decided there was a fairly good base here as well. If you talk to just, the people on the ground here, most people probably have never heard the word libertarian or would not self-identify that way. And certainly as an organization, we're very big tent. For us, ultimately, it's about, subscribing to the non-aggression principle, so, don't hurt people, follow the golden rule, and, and live and let live for the most part. But, yeah, New Hampshire certainly is unique in this area, and the people here who are born and raised here really have that live and let live mentality. I mean, the state motto is live free or die. It doesn't get more strident than that, really. General Stark, from the Revolutionary War, came up with that. And, of course, the whole saying is live free or die, and death is not the worst of evils.
I don't know that live free or die automatically draws a picture of peace and all of that, because
no, and I always like to say
it's a declaration.
Die,
you keep pushing, I'm going to kill you. That's funny.
And and so it's been great being here and really starting to see the base within the state. Just the natives starting to really identify with these ideas, and of course, I think since September 11th, just in the past 15 years, the country has really fundamentally changed. I mean, we see it with the militarization of the police. We had an incident here a couple of years ago where I don't know if you're familiar with the plan where the federal government is basically giving militarized vehicles like the Bearcat and other equipment to state and local police. They do it through a grant program, but basically they are, starting to militarize the police in a way that, of course, our founding fathers would be horrified by. It's a violation of the Posse Comitatus. It's, there's a reason why you shouldn't have a standing army in a free country. Sure. And in the grant application, and this was out of Concord, which is the state capital, the then police chief, who subsequently no longer works there, wrote that they needed this Bearcat, for to guard against domestic terrorism, and then cited the Occupy movement, the sovereign citizens movement, and Free Staters as the reason for this. And of course, I mean, we were horrified. I was, outraged, quite frankly. So, we took to the streets. We went and we protested. We had a good 300 people show up. We testified. We kept them there till 11 o'clock at night. In the end, we didn't win that battle, but something like that could only, I believe, happen in a place like New Hampshire. It happened 2 years before that in Keene, New Hampshire, and other than that, I'm only familiar with one city, and it was out on the West Coast in Berkeley, where they pushed back against something like that. And now, because of the liberty sort of sense here, there is a state rep who's introduced a bill, which is currently in the House, that, is proposing that the state and local police cannot get any kind of militarized equipment that is not available on the commercial market. So that'll be an interesting bill to sort of follow. So one of the things that I find the most appealing about the Free State Project and what we're trying to accomplish here is to sort of create a beacon of liberty, to really get people who care about these issues together. People work on different things. Some people run for office. Some people bring their businesses. There's a big alternate currency, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency component here. And then, we have people who exercise civil disobedience. So it really sort of runs the gamut, and I think that's what makes it fascinating for people, because you really can find your niche here and find what you're passionate about and then work on those things. And then, of course, also, it's a big commitment to say to people, you have to up your life and move somewhere. So even in my opinion, the act of moving here and just being a good neighbor and being a productive, responsible human being is enough activism. It's good to be surrounded by like-minded people, and it's extremely liberating and actually kind of special.
Tell me something, just so I can understand, because and by the way, I've had Michigan's state chairwoman on for the Libertarian Party, and her and I had this conversation a little bit also, and I've certainly had a lot of Republicans on. When you consider the libertarian movement, forget the parties and those type of things, do you think that it leans left or do you think that it leans right? Where do you see the libertarian movement at? That's
a fascinating question. I would say probably a little right, and I'm thinking more of, the work done by the Mises Institute and people like Tom Woods and sort of the folks coming from a more solid classical liberal, as you mentioned earlier, economic background. But I think after the Occupy fiasco, although, kudos to them at least to realize something is wrong, even though they have the wrong solutions to the problems. Recognizing there is a problem is a step in the right direction. I think there has been sort of a little swing. I wonder also if, as the movement matures, there's this sort of feeling of trying to build alliances and meet where there is overlap. I mean, certainly in our community, I would say it's a fairly strong anti-war sentiment for the most part. And, just because, it's both wasteful and the waste of human life and, just the tragedy that is war. But so I would say anti-war is probably more a lefty sort of issue. Yeah. But I think, for most people who kind of get to these ideas, I would say they get there through two ways, either through, economics and sort of trying to figure out the bubbles and why am I broke or why do I have so much credit card debt or, that side, or then it's kind of the more, I would say, soft emotional stuff, which is more anti-war or how do we help people or...
Sometimes, Carla, not to debate you, but sometimes no war causes more death than war, and you have to look at individual circumstances. I tend to be a non-interventionist. But so was Thomas Jefferson, and he went to war. And so you have to stand back and say, we have to look at these things individually. I'm certainly not in a hurry to send anybody to battle to kill anybody at the risk of their own life. That's nonsensical thinking. On the other hand, if taking an action will save life, I don't know that we can just make a sweeping deal. But listen, what I want to do is we're going to go to a break in just a second. When we come back, I want to take you back to the militarization of the police thing, just for a little bit of a dialogue, because I've got some different thoughts, and I want to have a friendly exchange on that. So if we can, Carla, stay with us, folks. We'll be right back.
Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.
Welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show. Listen, on the line with us is Carla Garrick. Am I saying it right?
That one's perfect.
Where? I practiced for the whole time we were off the air. Listen, Carla is the president of Free State Project, which can be found at freestateproject.org. And in the subject line of the emails we talked about earlier, capitalism, libertarianism, cold weather, and freedom, as her organization is trying to gather folks in New Hampshire that are liberty-minded. one of the things that we talked about off the air, folks, Carla and I did, is I'm a little bit conflicted with the militarization of the police issue. And let me explain it. And then, Carla, I'm hoping you'll set me on the right path.
I'll give it a good shot.
I spent my teenage years living at my sister's house. My brother-in-law is a police officer. And so I grew up, as I say, through those formative years being surrounded by my brother-in-law, law enforcement officer, and many of his friends and his partner. And as a young man, I went to Vegas with a group of cops, which was probably my wildest trip to Vegas, I might add. And it was memorable. And at any rate, when I think of militarization, and first off, I would agree with you when Premier Obama, as I affectionately refer to him, talked about his national police force back when he was candidate Obama. I had flashes of your papers, please, in a train somewhere just outside Berlin. So I certainly would rail heartily against a national police force, even though I grew up in a police environment. The other side of this that causes me to be conflicted on the topic is that when we pulled out of Vietnam, forget your opinion of Vietnam, when we pulled out, we left more equipment in Vietnam than the entire British kingdom had access to, than they owned. We just left it. So part of it is my fiscal conservatism, to be frank with you. We brought a lot of that equipment home. We left a lot in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but we brought a lot home. So does it sit out in some field somewhere and rot? If you ever look at pictures of the Soviet Union's former weaponry, everything from nuclear submarines to tanks, literally in the fact you can still see them. They're sitting in fields. The submarines have literally rotted open and sunk in their slips. And I think, what a waste. And I combat that with, there's a funny chosen word, by the way, but I combat that debate with the militarization of police. And then I have flashes of Ferguson. And I would think about my brother-in-law or those people that I grew up with standing there with people throwing rocks and shooting at them and everything else. And I think, I definitely don't want an M1A1 tank rolling down the streets of America. But that's not what these police forces are being given. They're being given essentially vehicles that can protect them from the rocks and the Molotov cocktails when you're seeing it. So I wrestle with it a little bit, and whenever I get into this dialogue with a libertarian, they'll talk about founding fathers, and amen to that. And then I have flashes of the stories I've read about George Washington putting down the Whiskey Rebellion, and so I'm very frank with you. I'm conflicted on the topic, so set me straight, Carla.
Well, it is a tough one because I think of all the arguments you could make, probably the fiscal one would be the one that would likely to convince me more. But for me, it's really an issue of what's the thinking behind it. And once I think you militarize, we actually saw it happen, right? When police officers moved from the idea of being a peace officer. So, he might have caught kids in the playground smoking a joint and, would drive them home and maybe tell the parents, but, wouldn't send them to jail and then end up being unable to get a good job and the whole thing that we have now with the drug war. When we moved sort of from peace officers to law enforcement officers and more laws get written. So, there's a great book that's called 3 Felonies a Day, and it pretty much is that any average American now commits 3 felonies a day because there's so many laws, we don't even know that we're breaking them, right?
I think you're absolutely right with that thinking, but I can tell you specifically, most of the law enforcement officers that I know, both currently that call on the gun shop I own, and also the folks that I grew up with, they're no more in favor of the 40 million laws there are in the books than you and I. In fact, one of them recently told me he's at the end of his career, he retired. I said, "Do you miss it?" He said, when I was in the first half to 2/3 of my career, and he came from Muskegon, Michigan, he said, if I said to a citizen on the street, "Stop, I need to ask you a question," they'd turn around and say, "Yes, sir, how can I help you?" He said in the final third of his career, they'd tell him, I can't repeat what he said, but they would tell him off very, very colorfully and keep right on walking. And I tell you that because, yes, there's been a change in law from peace to law enforcement. Let me just insert a short story because it kind of buttresses your argument, maybe not mine. But back in the 60s, my brother was 15. He got drunk, came home very, very late. My mother called him into the bedroom to say, his name is Steve. Steve, bend over, let me smell your breath. And as he bends over, he passes out on the floor. So my mother, being my mother, she scoops him up and takes him into the Rochester City Police. That's where we lived in Rochester, Michigan. Takes him into the Rochester City Police. They take a mug shot of him leaning up against the line. It was all theatrics. It was law enforcement being peace officers scaring him straight. And nowadays, if that would have happened, he would have gotten an MIP. She probably would have been a ticket. Someone would have needed a lawyer. But listen, that to me is about treasury. I spent a lot of time in court as an activist, and I remember watching one judge in Pontiac, Michigan, tell one of the people he was dealing with. He said, "You don't understand what this chair is. I collect treasury. Don't you understand me? That's my job." And it was the only time I've ever heard one be candid about what their actual role is, by the way. But that is their role. Where I'm going with this little bit of mantra is that that's what citizens have voted for. These things aren't happenstance. They've continued to elect the people that have created a culture of saying I'm a good legislator if I shepherd my bill to law, regardless of what my bill is. And so now you've got these 40 million laws on the books that no one can keep track of, to your point. And law enforcement, I mean, the cop, I mean, he's surveilling himself. He can't make a judgment call because the video is going to get reviewed. So he can't say, you know what, I understand this. I'm going to drop you off at home. Be good. He can't do those things anymore. And we as a society have demanded that he or she be different than they used to be. Am I off base on that, Carla?
Well, actually, what I wanted to insert here is these are the kinds of things that we love to debate up here. And, in fact, we have a conference coming up, which is called the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, nhlibertyforum.com. And this is where, we talk about these issues and we get smart people out. We have Sheriff Mack will be out this time, Jeffrey Tucker, who writes a lot on this. We've had people like Radley Balco, who wrote a wonderful book on the subject, and it's called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. And we actually bought, several boxes of these books to give to the legislature when we were going through this issue with the Bearcats. So I would highly recommend maybe people check that out and come and find out more. With regard to the sort of peace officers to law enforcement, what I'm concerned about is that sort of the next step in that trajectory is, the militarization of police. And there are studies that will tell you, when people wear a doctor's coat, for example, in an experiment they did, if they're told it's a doctor's coat, they think they're a doctor and they do better in the tests. And when they're told it's an artist's smock, they do more poorly. I just think this idea of giving people, military-grade equipment, guns, ballistic engineered armored vehicles, that kind of stuff, I think, starts to create more of a mentality within the ranks then of being we, the people, are the enemy, right? And once we get to that point, I think it's a really small step towards more tyranny and more tyrannical, the papers, please. I mean, we're borderline close to the papers, please phase of things. People's passports have the RFID chips in now. New Hampshire, actually, that was one of the bills a lot of Free State Project participants fought against. And New Hampshire is, I believe it's the only state or one of a handful of states that said no to the RFID cards, so we don't have them. But apparently from next year, unless you have a driver's license that has it, you're not going to be able to travel. You can't get a passport anymore, or from 2016, unless it's cleared through the IRS. So if you have tax issues, so the borders are getting tighter and smaller, and, it's not, in my opinion, an issue of, Premier Obama or, President Bush. It's not a left-right paradigm anymore. It's really an issue of, what does the average person want in their life, And statistically, you're 7 times more likely to be killed in America by a police officer, 8 times more likely than a terrorist. So this sort of fear-mongering, and, I grew up in South Africa, so I grew up in a police state, and I see it all unfolding before my eyes, and it's scary on the one hand, but then knowing that there's a solution, which I regard the Free State Project as, as a place where, educated people come together and they're sort of trying to figure out how do we stop some of this, or are these the best options, or at least let's debate these issues. Let's have that conversation instead of just, willy-nilly following what the mainstream media tells us, is news.
Well, one of the things that you touched on somewhere in our conversation this morning is the type of armament that police have that citizens don't have, and you also in the description of your organization, or actually in defense of New Hampshire, talked about the liberty that gun ownership has, and I want to take us back to gun ownership for a minute, and I think sometimes it's part of what stops folks from finding agreement. And that's the definition of things. So when you talk about militarized armament, let me use an assault rifle as an example, an AR, typically chambered in .223. I don't know how gun familiar you are, but the media calls an AR an assault rifle, even though the reason an AR is called an AR is because the armor light rifle is what it was named when it was invented in the 1950s. And it typically shoots a round that your great-grandfather and grandfather would have taken squirrel hunting. And yet the media has demonized it and called it militarization of citizenship and all kinds of other things. And if I spray painted it pink or beige or white or any other color other than black, maybe people would ease up on it. But I get into this little bit of a rant only because when we look at police departments and say they're being militarized, and we identify things like ARs that they're using, or I don't want them in an army tank, but I wouldn't want my brother-in-law being called on to walk undefended down the streets of Ferguson during those riots. I would not have asked a citizen of America to enter that zone without some form of defense. And so then I'm called to say, if we don't put them in some kind of protective vehicle, then what do? Just back away from the community and let it shoot itself up and burn itself down? And I wrestle with those things because once we get past the hyperbolism of political words.
I mean, the governor could have called out the National Guard. The National Guard already has this equipment. The point is that, to then have, basically what the federal government is trying to do is to create a national police force. And if that doesn't scare you...
Listen, I'm not advocating it, Carla, but I'm saying that we're splitting hairs between calling out a state militia versus calling up a city police department or a state police post that has the means to defend itself. And I know I prefaced up front.
I don't think it's splitting hairs, and I think the founders would fall on my side with that one. There's a reason that why does Posse Comitatus exist?
I got to tell you, when you say the founders would have, we don't know. And let me reiterate, I am a Jeffersonian. So I'm a classical liberal. I'm not debating you. I'm having a friendly conversation with you. But every time I find myself in this conversation, I point back to George Washington putting down the Whiskey Rebellion with federal forces. And I'm not advocating that, most certainly I'm not, but I'm saying that there's no point in history where we've not found example of that. And I would go as far to say that if we militarize a National Guard and then send the National Guard into Ferguson, the effect is the same. Whether we've found a different way to rationalize it or not, I just think it's a slippery slope either way.
The effect is not the same. The difference is, so by way of example, here in New Hampshire, they have, the National Guard has, I believe, up to 30 Bearcat vehicles, right?
Okay.
So there are enough of those things around if they need them in some kind of, random outlier crisis situation. The issue becomes, why does the police force, the people who were supposed to be the peace officers, why are they being taken down a path and who do they then think the enemy is. With our situation in Concord, they ended up amending the grant application to take out any reference to any parties and then replace the wording with, well, we might need them, if there are protests at the State House. Now, that is First Amendment protected speech. We're allowed to go there. We're allowed to, you're allowed to give the finger to a police officer if you want. There was a case here, which I couldn't believe actually went all the way to the Supreme Court, where a person who was involved in a case with an officer and as someone who was arrested for activism and, took it all the way to the First Court of Appeals and won and settled for, tens of thousands of dollars, I can tell you cops do lie. There are good cops. I'm hoping your brother is one of them. But, there is a tendency, I think, today, because we don't have the checks and balances that you would expect in a functioning legal system, is not there anymore. After Ferguson, when people really started researching police on citizen violence, lots of reporters were like, why can't we find these numbers?
Right.
It's because, they're being obscured. You can't find these numbers because people would actually probably get pretty upset if they knew the prevalence of these incidents today. And, so I look at it very broadly. I look at it from a very big picture situation. And, sorry, I just want to circle back. That license plate that went all the way to the Supreme Court on a First Amendment issue was a vanity plate that said cops lie. And the DMV here said you can't get that plate. And the guy sued, and he won. And, I think it's great. And in New Hampshire, we have some wonderful small-town cops who really are great guys. I see a different face in the bigger cities. I think that there is this sort of tendency towards a more tyrannical, we the people are the enemy way of thinking, and so it scares me. It really does.
Carla, I'm going to take us to a break, but when we come back, let's pick up on that, along with, by the way, the word I couldn't think of was unicam. But when we come back, let's touch on that a little bit, but segue to free speech zones. I think you'll like that topic.
That sounds great.
Stay with us, Carla. Folks, we'll be right back.
Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.
Welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show. My name is Mike Hewitt, and today we're on the line with Carla Garrick. Am I saying it again right or no?
Third time's a charm.
There you go. President of the Free State Militia, or Free State Militia, is a Freudian slip. Free State Project, which that's kind of actually funny, which can be found on the Free State at freestateproject.com. Irony being what it is, do you know where that little Freudian slip came from, Carla? Is I wrote a novel, and in fact I'm writing the sequel to it. I'm almost done with the sequel, and one of the terminologies from the novel was Free State Militia. So that's where that just kind of popped out of my mouth from. But
that was a Freudian slip. And I just want to clarify, it's actually freestateproject.org, and then for the Liberty Forum, it's nhlibertyforum.com. But you can get to Liberty Forum from the Free State website, which of course has tons of information about what makes it so special here. We try and post every day about some news that's pro-liberty from New Hampshire. And we recently actually brought out independently made, some Free Staters who had moved felt like they wanted to make a documentary to really capture what is so compelling about New Hampshire, and that's called 101 Reasons Why Liberty Lives in New Hampshire, and that's for free on YouTube if people want to go check that out. It's about an hour long, and it really sort of runs through all the reasons why the state of New Hampshire was chosen, and talks a little bit about the activism that people do here, which runs everything. I like to do the B's, the letter B, so it's from sort of beekeeping to Bitcoin, so everything from sort of local and farming all the way through to, cutting edge technology. And you had mentioned that that we should talk a little bit more about the militarization, but talk about free speech zones. So let's go.
Yeah, well, just, one of the things, folks, that Carla and I talked just briefly during the break, and my comment to her was, and my pushback to the position against, and I'm laughing at myself, I'm not advocating for militarization of police. I got to say that to you.
Are you sure?
I'm really not. But on the other hand, we talk about Bearcats. I look up Bearcat vehicles on the internet while we were talking in the second segment, just to make sure that I was on the right path with the name that you'd mentioned. And to me, they look like the same exact vehicles that banks have been using since the 40s or 50s. They're for transferring cash and coin. They're bank vaults, if you will, on wheels. That's what they look like to me. And my comment to you off the air, folks, to Carla, was that if I were a police officer in Ferguson, and they told me I couldn't ride in that vehicle during those riots, I'd say, call me when it's over. I'm going home. If I were a police officer and I were asked to be put into that circumstance without the proper tools to keep my own life, I would say I'm not going. Good luck with it. That's just me. And I'm not calling for the militarization, but I am saying that we've got to be really careful with what I consider to be populist rhetoric. I think the truth is, or the reality of what's necessary, is somewhere between the two positions. And again, I'm really not calling for the militarization. The last thing I want to hear when exiting a train is your papers, please. One of the things you mentioned in the first segment, though, Carla, is you mentioned somewhere in the show today, you used the word Occupy. So Occupy Wall Street, Occupy everywhere. Is your organization, does that have a relationship with Occupy?
No.
Okay. You listed them together with 2 or 3 or 4 organizations, which is...
No, the police chief of the city of Concord listed them together in a grant application to get a Bearcat. So,
I see. So I get it. So in his mind, the folks that want peace are on the same page as the folks that want to do a physical takeover of the area, which is what I considered Occupy to be, is I consider it a hostile takeover.
For me, Occupy was just, it was sort of, I think, interesting from afar to kind of watch, in the sense that it was, people at least protesting or coming to some realization. Of course, their reasoning, I think, is entirely flawed, but it was interesting to sort of see people, sort of banding together, coming together, and then the failure of Occupy was a failure of leadership. I mean, they're certainly in New Hampshire, everything was consensus-based. I mean, it was a joke, the way they were trying to do things.
Well,
and actually, in New Hampshire, there was a small Occupy movement here, and some individual Free Staters went to meet with them, and we're big proponents here of open carry, and so people were open carrying, and you can imagine that didn't go over very well with the Occupy, and it ended up with a split, and the most of the people actually going with the open carry, more left libertarians, than stuck with the original, 1%ers or 99%ers. So that was sort of interesting to see just on the ground here.
From a distance, it looked like 2 groups of people, paid activists and screwballs. I'm sorry to say, that was from the ground looking, that's what it looked like. I saw a lot of people with some very, very nice signage that I know they didn't make in their garage, and I put them in the paid category, and then there was a handful of people that were just flat wackos. But listen, rather than sliding downhill, I want to make, before we run out of time today, I want to talk about the concept of the freedom. The First Amendment zone. You're familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yes, and in fact, I used to work with the New Hampshire Writers Project, and we would do these sort of First Amendment meetups with journalists.
Right.
And I had a fascinating conversation, or maybe it was more just a penny drop conversation with three biggish newspaper editors here where, we were talking about the First Amendment, and I asked them, so what are your views on the free speech zones? And they were like, what do you mean? I'm like, isn't everywhere a free speech zone? Or do you think they should be able to tell you right here you're allowed to, let's put you in the little, and, this is hubris, but, let's put you in your little cattle cart right here, and here you're allowed to be free and say what you want, but you can't do it anywhere else, which to me is just absolutely ridiculous.
Imagine telling Patrick Henry, go stand inside the snow fence and you can say whatever you want.
Exactly my point.
I mean, I get a kick out of it, but you do have free First Amendment areas signage in New Hampshire, especially I'm told, or I'm reading, I should say, that these First Amendment areas tend to be around college campuses. Now, I don't know if that's true in New Hampshire, but it seems to be Connecticut all the way to California, that there seems to be that mindset that they can set aside areas where you can ramble, which is, I mean, it's almost like they're wanting to go put the nuts inside then they can say whatever they want, and that's such a deviation. To me, those are the fearsome things, even more so than whether law enforcement should have a Bearcat or not. The idea that they're going to squelch our freedom of speech, which is the foundation of America in my mind, buttressed, by the way, by the Second Amendment, which is one of the reasons I own a gun shop. So what do you think? Is there a pushback that we should have to this?
Well, yes, and to some extent I wonder if that ship has sailed because, they are enforcing that in various states. To my knowledge, New Hampshire, I've never seen one. I've never heard an issue about that. So far, so good here, keeping our fingers crossed. To your point, I actually think all of these little pieces, the militarization or the free speech zones or freedom, right to carry, whether you call it these assault rifles, these are all little pieces of the same puzzle. And when you start to build the big picture, you realize, the picture that's being painted is not favorable for more liberty, more freedom, more personal responsibility. The picture that's being painted is a tyrannical march down towards, a actual police state.
No question about it. Carla, I'm getting the 30-second sign. Tell folks how they can get a hold of your organization.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me on today. I really enjoyed our conversation. If you want to find out more about the Free State Project, please visit freestateproject.org. We also have a Facebook page. Come over to the page, like it. If you have some questions, get involved. And then for our conference coming up, it's nhlibertyforum.com. And then in the summer, we throw a huge camping event where we have about 2,000 people who come up.
Okay, Carla, we're off, but I appreciate you very, very much. Folks, we'll see you next Wednesday.
Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.